And I don't know if you remember the questions that I asked you guys to consider when we were starting this, but maybe we could address them now as a panel, and if anybody has questions, they can come up to the microphones and ask them. But one of the first things I want to address is it good? You know, having networked biology, what good has come of it? And so we've each given our presentations, but it would be good to kind of expound upon that a little bit. But before I do, let's take some questions.
Wow. You guys are doing applied informatics, especially the first two ladies with the greeting the people. And I would just add that if you want to hook people in more, make it like a sporting event and have a timeline, time to discovery. And every time a new discovery is made, you ring a bell, or do something big.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people would look into discovery a lot. And I've started collecting discoveries, and every week there are more and more discoveries. And I don't know if I have a question for you, except to keep going.
Thank you.
And remember that applied informatics and precision medicine is for us, the people, who I don't even call patients anymore. Mm-hmm. And the more you can get to us, the more you scientists will be able to come up with the discoveries that's going to change the world.
Thank you.
So I have a question. So we're talking about the data sharing and breaking the data silos. So what do you do to incentivize those individuals or institution or hospital or even commercial company to share the data? And is there any sort of regulatory incentive, commercial incentive, or is just like how do you incentivize people?
So those are definitely questions that we think about a lot in the Global Alliance, certainly, and it requires a somewhat different response depending on what data you're talking about, right? So I think in the US there are options to incentivize data sharing by requiring that data be deposited into a repository of some kind if it's publicly funded, and that does happen at the moment with data that are deposited into dbGaP if they're funded by the NIH. And as I think anyone that's worked with dbGaP is aware, it's not that user-friendly of a resource, and so we would argue that we would want to go beyond that, but that's one method that could be used. For for-profit companies, it's a great question. I think that a lot of clinical sequencing labs that are for-profit have begun to see, there's sort of a cultural shift that has been taking place to some extent. We have a lot of collaborators in the BRC exchange, for example, that are clinical labs that are really excited to pool their variant data. They don't necessarily pool the clinical data that they have, but they do realize that if they're able to make better clinical calls, that's good for them, that's good for business. So I think that there is a little bit of a shift that's taking place in the sort of the way that the business model is conceptualized. But it's true that, for example, national databases overseas, often their sustainability is dependent on their proprietary data storage. And so I think that we as an organization are working on encouraging national funders to think about data sharing as an avenue toward improved human health, not just research, but also data sharing to be something that's worth funding. Because, as you say, it's not always an easy thing to incentivize.
And there's another aspect to data sharing, not just sharing the information among researchers, but sharing the information back to the patients.
Sure.
And I think what Corey is doing with the metastatic breast cancer project is a really good example. It's much more motivating as a patient to enroll in a study or enroll in a clinical trial when you're going to get some feedback about the value of what you're contributing, especially when you're a patient that may not get the treatment that they need to stay alive. At least you can see what you're contributing to science. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a wonderful model.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The attribution for patients or for data contributors for sequencing laboratories is a surprisingly effective incentive that organizations like to see that their name is on the data that have been contributed.
Yep. And especially when getting patients to enroll in clinical trials is so difficult, this could be
Yeah.
a motivating thing for patients.
And it's something that we had no idea when we started our study. It was largely unexplored. It was a big question mark. We sat around the round table for many months. What is it that patients want? What is going to be actual engagement? What's going to make them feel like this is worthwhile? And it was information, just information back in aggregate about what they have done to contribute. When they have their saliva kit sent in, we say thank you. We let them know we've received it, what we're going to do with it, what it's going to be used for, what we're hoping to discover. And then when we make discoveries, even though we haven't produced any genomic data, we've produced a lot of data and we've shared it all back with the patients, and it's hugely engaging. And then one other point I just wanted to say about breaking down silos, getting institutions to share, we're relying 100% on patients and the word of the patient to provide us the data through their consent. And after we have their consent, then we have access to all of their medical records, get their genomic data, and we can make a clinically annotated data set for everybody. And hopefully, working with like Global Alliance and other groups, we can make that data open and accessible to everybody in a very user-friendly way.
So I want to throw in two comments. One is that, as patients and participants in research studies, it's very important to have your voice clearly heard in favor of data sharing. Because often one thing that people use as a reason not to share is, participants would prefer if we don't share. They trusted the data to us here at Harvard, but they wouldn't be so happy if you guys somewhere else looked at it. And it's important to be very clear, as advocacy organizations, where what you believe. In some cases like autism, it's been very clear. They say, hey, what are you talking about? What we want is for a cure. We don't care who finds the cure. We want as many people to benefit from, the donation. So, and I think, from scientists, I think tools to make data sharing easier, and sometimes it's basically tools that make it easy to move the data around. Sometimes it's tools that make it easy to ask questions about big databases. In some sense, if you take these big data sets of sequence data that are out there, if the way to analyze them is to say, I need to make my own copy, there's probably only a handful of groups in the world who can do that. And so we need to think about ways to say, can you ask a question of the data without having that? Mm-hmm. And for funders, they should basically ask, if you fund a big study, you should expect that the data is going to be usable and accessible to others.
Well, and to add one other complication, one other issue in sharing data is that patients do not always have access to their data, and we don't always have access to our tissues. When you go to a particular hospital and you sign it, it's a research hospital, and you sign a consent, and then later, for instance, you find you have a genomic cancer and there's a trial at another hospital you want to go to, you can't always get your tissue out of the first hospital to get qualified for the other clinical trial. So there are issues related to ownership of patient data and tissue that also have to be resolved to get more people to donate.
That's true.
That's a perfect segue to my question. And this is, I think, maybe starting with Rachel, and it's a technical question about the designated record set, because it was really amazing to see the recent HIPAA high-tech amendment that basically was a middle finger to New York State, who still had a law that said you're not allowed to get your laboratory test results unless it's authorized by a physician. And that amendment said that all laboratory test results have to be made available to patients at the same time as physicians. And only in a limited set of circumstances can a doctor who maybe fears that a patient's suicidal, for example, actually has to go through a process to block access to the data. But what I've seen happen since then, so that's great, but what I've seen happen since then is that there's been taking a very narrow view of what belongs in the designated record set. So in genomic data, what you really want is, for long-term utility, is a BAM file or VCF file. But the clinicians will only include the variants that they sign off on. So who's running, or the director of the genetic testing laboratory. And so if you go through your right, and it's a HIPAA-covered entity who's running your test result, you can request your lab result, but it's only going to get the data that the laboratory, the geneticist has signed off on, and you won't get your raw data that later could be useful that you could go donate to research or whatever you want to do with it. And so the question is the Global Alliance working on this issue specifically around genomic data and the designated record set? You mentioned designated record set. I wasn't sure if you were talking about health records at the time or genomics.
Yeah, so I was mentioning an ongoing project that's actually collaboration between a group at the Broad Institute that I'm working on as on behalf of the Global Alliance, because this is something that we're really interested in. And we are asking that question of what genomic data qualifies to be a part of your designated record set. Currently, the language that describe the designated record set are rather vague. There is not a specific designation of whether your BAM files count or whether your VCF counts or your variant calls count. But we're working on a project that's going to, we're currently in the process of filing an administrative complaint because we have not received data from a certain testing company that we've tried to get data from. We're working on filing an administrative complaint with the Office of Civil Rights in Washington, D.C. Right now, as we speak, to clarify what that will be. But I should say that I'm working on that as sort of a consultant from the Global Alliance. That work is being led by members of the Broad Institute.
I was wondering about, like with social media stuff, about the difference between something like cancer, which is sort of very immediate, and something like fibromyalgia, which is more of a chronic, long-term, maybe less intense thing. And your thoughts about that, and also, you know, with talking about starting websites and things, just the idea, are there templates that people, you know, especially if you're talking about something very rare, you know, it might be a patient wanting to start a website. Is there some sort of template that's available?
Do you want to start?
If you are looking to blog, WordPress is a site that's very easy to go to, and you can set up a blog very quickly for free, and you don't have to worry about being fancy, and you can put whatever data you want on it. As far as information in other patient communities, I actually found out about blogging from the diabetes community, and I think RA communities, and a couple others, people who have chronic diseases that they have to live with every day. They are extremely active, and there's a lot of information in social media there. When you go to sites like Smart Patients or Inspire or Patients Like Me, et cetera, you can usually find a patient community for a particular disease type and get started there and see who's out there.
And then I'll just add a couple things to that. So you can, if you want to start your own website, you can go to squarespace.com and you can start your own website depending on what you want to do. But one of the most useful things that bits of advice that I give to people that are looking for others is to just go onto social media and watch for a little while. So I was working with somebody recently who was trying to get together a cohort of people that had a very rare type of ovarian cancer. And I said, let's just type it into Facebook and let's just see. And sure enough, within a half an hour, she had 35 other people that had this exceedingly rare type of ovarian cancer. She had a cohort of people that were, it was like an instant support group. And there wasn't necessarily a group focused on that. She started it. And so they all joined, and now that's just, you know, instead of having to build a website and do whatever, if the sole purpose is coming together with other people for shared experiences, you can just leverage social media right now the way it is. And if a group doesn't exist, you can make one and then just type in whatever it is that you're interested in trying to pull people together for, and sure enough, you'll find them posting stuff.
Twitter's a really good place
And
to
Twitter's
start.
good too, yeah. Depends. There's usually there's not a lot of overlap between Twitter and Facebook communities. No. There's one
Not
or the
everybody
other.
thinks in 140 characters.
Yeah.
I'm really happy you guys are talking about patient data sharing rights, because it's something that I personally really identify with. And I really like in particular that you mentioned that this is a civil right. I find that profound, and I find that for the types of movements that we in the PGP really want to happen at some point, that kind of thing needs to be more accepted. So I built a genome interpretation platform, and one of the things that keeps me from building it out further is the constant fear that the FDA will just completely destroy it. So I'd like to hear your take on that. I really, like running my own research study, I want to give back to the users as much as possible, and that means not just raw data, but actual interpretations of what it means. But doing so comes with a huge risk. So,
Gonzalo, can you speak to that?
I could try. So, you know, right now, you know, some of the interpretations are very broad. You know, you know, I hope that Kathy and precision medicine and all these things happening will get it to a more sensible space, in the sense that, you know, you could imagine that, you know, if you're making a decision about your chemotherapy or what drugs you're going to take, you know, you probably want to do that with your doctor and with someone who knows your medical history with context. You know, the genome could give you clues, but it's not going to prescribe a drug for you. And it would not make sense to prescribe based on a genome without knowing context. You know, you could imagine extreme cases, like if you see an interesting mutation in a gene that you think causes Mendelian disease in a child that's suspected of having the disease, you're probably right in your interpretation. But if you see it in a 50-year-old that's very healthy, you'll probably say, hey, this is one of the mutations where I would get things wrong. And so I think the FDA currently says, at least told us, that basically giving risk predictions is a diagnosis that can only be given by a medical doctor. You know, I don't know, your effort might be outside this kind of context because you're saying, hey, I'm putting in a tool where people bring their data and they use it. And you could say, hey, I've designed this so doctors could use it to decide what the best advice is. But it's a very complicated legal landscape. I don't know, when we've talked, you know, we were called by the FDA when we started Genes for Good, and we were advised to only talk to them with people from the Office of Legal Counsel at Michigan, and it was very good advice. So.
Good, thanks.
I had the same question that was actually asked a little earlier, but I was going to kind of comment on it and then ask a little further. So my question was, what genetic data were you able to get from the labs? So I work on data that isn't necessarily reported, and we try to get it back. So I'm a clinical geneticist in training and also a bioinformaticist. So I try to get the data that they don't give us on the report and see if we can gain more information from it. And there's been a couple of labs have been very good about getting that. And as you may know, some of the NGS panels that we send actually have a lot of data that isn't reported. That data is really valuable for research. There's a question as to whether even physicians can get access to it, let alone patients. The response that I've had from the labs that don't offer it are, we report, you know, related to the current, what information we have, and they're worried about liability for things that they didn't see or didn't find in the data. I guess what steps are you taking, and how far, so when you look at genomic data, are you going to try to get VCF files, the final report, or BAM files? And have you had experience with patients trying to get that data? I mean, as a clinician, I have a hard time. It's got to be really hard for patients.
You're looking at me, so I'm assuming it's a patient question. Yes, it can be extremely difficult. And on the one hand, I'm very much a believer in patients that have their own data, but I have also seen the side effects of what happens when a desperate family member gets a genomic report that says there's a mutation in this gene, but the treatment is for a fusion in that gene, and the drug does not work for it's just a point mutation, and the person goes ballistic, and why won't you give me this drug? And so it's a fine line, and I'm really not sure what the right answer is there. Patients who want to be able to get their data and then donate it, I would hope would be able to get it, but it's not always easy. Some states allow you to get your medical record, but you have to pay for copying, and they can charge you as much as they want. So.
And I'll note that it's not actually stored in your medical record.
Yeah.
All that's in there is a PDF with the changes they decide are significant, but all that data exists somewhere, and it belongs to the patient in my opinion.
Yeah, I've seen pathologists at academic hospitals will only report on the genes that are actionable and not report on the others. So I haven't seen anybody test that yet. It's hard enough for us to get data on the genes that are actionable.
This may be a little off topic, but in terms of openness and availability to patients, I have samples of hair and nail from my mom and a benign lipoma in a cryogenic freezer at a university. I'm trying to find a place that would be willing to sequence them for me for my own personal information. I haven't been able to find a place. Does anybody know of a lab that would be willing to do this kind of work? You know, just having me pay for it or for in the interest of science.
Jay Lake went to Illumina to get it all done, and they did it for him on a pay-for basis, but then the result is they give you the data, and then you have to figure out what to do with it.
So you can also come to Veritas Genetics, which is the sponsor of the event, and it's also my company. So our company is also co-founded by George Church. So we sequence people's genome for 999 and also give the interpretation.
This would be like a hair and nail sample, not a blood sample.
Yeah, that's probably the preparation.
Outside? Okay. Thanks.
So let's say I'm a patient. I can manage to get my data out of the system, and now I have a terabyte maybe of data sitting on a hard drive somewhere. What do I do with it? Like, do I stick it in a firebox and just wait for the rest of the information to come out, or, you know, long-term storage kind of things?
Well, why did you do why would you have done the sequencing?
Maybe I was like curious about a variant, the HLA region or something. But
Well,
there's another piece that's in there.
You could donate it to the Personal Genome Project. But if you're looking to do something with it, there are consultants you can pay to look at it. But they tend to specialize in certain areas. If you get somebody who's a cancer specialist, they may not be looking at an inherited disease issue. And that's about the limit of my knowledge on the subject.
Yeah, you could take it to a genomic counselor who could work in tandem with a bioinformatician to try and come up with, you know, different variants that are from standard references.
Yeah, I think it's true that that there aren't a lot of options to donate whole genomes
Certainly certainly not standard.
that are not like if you don't want it to be fully open, for example, or something like, I don't know that there are options to donate variants, and so you would probably have to go through the process of analyzing it right now. But I think that's coming. So yeah, so maybe put it under your mattress for a couple of years.
Get big bump.
But like, do you have an idea of like where under, it's more of a question of like where under the mattress do you put it? How do you store it in a format that somebody is going to be able to work on later?
It would most likely be in a BAM or VCF file, which is kind of the standard for genomic information to be held in. And that's just it's pretty standard. So whereas you can't open it on like Microsoft Word or anything, anybody who works in the space of genomics would be able to open that up.
And I guess you'd probably, I would start on the cloud. That would be the most convenient thing. But the big question about when people get these big raw data files is how can they interact with them and ask interesting questions? And that's, that came up, and it's for people that get data from us, that's their most common question. And actually right now, for most of the specific questions they have, we've been told we can't really give them any particular guidance. And the other thing that's interesting is that right now, and this is where I think standards for exchanging data, if you got your medical records and say, I want to donate them to a research project, if you got them as, here's your printed out medical records, a PDF of 500 pages, it'd be pretty tough for someone to figure out how to use that. So it's important to kind of figure out how to actually exchange data between these different health record systems in standard ways, so it could be combined and analyzed together.
I had hoped that we would have a separate Omic record for people, and that it would, and I'd said to the Broad when they asked how to combine clinic and genomic information, I said, for God's sake, don't go to the healthcare system. And I hate to see us in interoperability issue again, wasting our brain power from Harvard and MIT and Michigan and UCLA on these interoperability issues about how to use the data. I think people should have an Omic record, and can you imagine, or is there any talk about that? I know they mentioned it at first at NIH.
Okay, and then the next question.
Yeah, next question.
It seems to me like we're kind of at a beginning stage of what's going to be an exponential growth in the amount of data that patients and non-patients are sharing with researchers and each other and the rest of the community. And I'm wondering if any of you feel that there's a sort of a first mover advantage right now for people that are able to get their sequence or are able to get their samples or get their medical records out and shared, as compared to, say, 5, 10, 15 years from now when it's more of a standard thing that happens everywhere. So like, do you see that in the future there will kind of be a tragedy of abundance in that there's too many people trying to give you data, so there's too much data for you to look at, such that sharing data isn't going to gain me anything 10 years from now? As I released my genome about 2 weeks ago.
You know, as a cancer patient that's currently NED, I'm holding off before I go and even access my own data, because the pace of changes in technology are so rapid that what might be deep today might be shallow in a year. And so I think there's actually an advantage to holding off to some level, depending on what type of sequencing you're interested in. So I think it can go both ways.
Well,
and then,
and there's even an issue that given that cancer is an evolution of a cell, and once a gene mutates, it continues to mutate. If you have your sequencing done now, and a year later it might be completely different. So there's no point necessarily in doing it now if you might need it later. It also is getting cheaper.
yeah, exactly. That's another thing. It's getting cheaper. And then to get to the point of having a separate omics, I think that the vision, the larger vision, at least at the Broad, is that patients will have the power and ability to share their data and to have it for themselves. But it's going to take a long time. Not a long time, but it's going to take lots of regulatory overcomings to get there. So, but that is the vision, and that is how we're trying to lay it out in terms of building the infrastructure. Okay, thank you.